So just to give you a little bit of an idea where we are. So we are located here in Vienna. It is, I mean, I'm pretty sure most of you know Vienna, or at least have heard about it, but it's actually quite a distance. So unfortunately, as a good continental European, I'm using SI metrics. So it's about roughly 1,250 kilometers to Cambridge. And if you go the same direction towards the south or southeast, you are in Istanbul. So this is kind of to give you a little bit an idea of where we are located in Austria. What do we do in our lab? We're actually looking at transition metal catalysis, and we are looking at the chemistries of those molecules, and we are also developing tools and protocols to tackle reaction mechanisms, solvation, conformers, counter-ions, and so on. And today will be more of a bit of a technical talk, less on chemistry, although there will be a bit of chemistry, but I will focus more on the tools that I developed, or that we developed in our group. When you think about computational chemistry, so what a typical computational chemist does, so you have a problem that is quite often inspired by experiment. So you have an experiment that you want to understand. So this is your experimental reference system. And then you take to the computer, and actually what we do is we calculate then a very simplified model system that hardly, or more or less, hopefully, somewhat resembles the actual system. The beauty of this is that the models that we use, they are very simple, easy to calculate, but it might be that they are not good models of the actual experimental system. So for example, in an experiment, a reaction typically takes place in solvent, and then we as computational or theoretical chemists, we go ahead and we just calculate them in implicit solvents, or more or less an isolated molecule in vacuum. What I'm interested in is actually to go beyond these kind of standard models and to actually develop better models, or more realistic models, that are a better description of the reality. So that means that our aim is to perform calculations at the experimental conditions. So for example, by including explicit solvent, counter-ions, and so on and so forth. And potentially by doing so, we have a better description, a more realistic model, and hopefully a better predictability. But of course, this all comes at the price that our chemical model gets more complex. And how does a computational workflow typically look like? So typically we start out by picking a chemical model. This is nowadays at least the full-fledged catalyst. So at least the molecular catalyst that we want to study, or the molecule that we want to study. We then pick a method. So we pick a computational model. This could be an electronic structure method, or if you want to perform dynamics, we pick a force field and so on, and calculate our properties. If we are decent, well-trained chemists, then of course we benchmark our calculations. So that means we look at experimental data or high-level computational reference data and see if what we have calculated, if it actually matches up. More often than not, it doesn't. So we have to go back, adjust our computational model a little bit until we have kind of a consistency here. And typically, a lot of effort is put into improving the computational model. So going, up the DFT density functional ladder, or going to wave function methods, and really trying to improve the computational model. What has been much less thought about is actually improving the chemical model. And that, of course, Philip did a lot of groundbreaking work in this regard, thinking about conformers, explicit solvents, incorporation of counter-ions. So coming up with a chemical model that is not just only the catalyst that we want to study, but maybe the catalyst in different conformers, counter-ions, explicit solvent molecules, and so on and so forth. And as I said, typically less effort is put into this part. But it has been shown that if we look at, I mean, nowadays it's quite well known that if we look at the relevant conformers, or if we neglect the relevant conformers, the errors that we are making are actually much larger than the errors, or could be much larger than the errors that we are making by picking a not so ideal or not so good density functional. So the idea or the goal of my work is essentially that we are trying to develop models for studying for describing solution chemistry. And this whole research was actually inspired a couple of years back when I thought about structures in solutions. So as Philip said, I'm a trained quantum chemist. So I come from looking at isolated molecules in ultra-high vacuum, single structure. And now I thought about modeling molecules in solution. So basically, when we think about structures and solutions, so the example that kind of sparked my interest in this regard was a vitamin B12 derivative. So you have the cobalt-chlorine structure here, and then instead of your methyl group or cyanide group, you have this kind of slightly modified group here. But I was interested in the electronic properties, so I started calculations on these molecules. Now, when I performed my typical DFT calculations, then of course I came up with an optimized structure in the gas phase. And of course, because I have these polar amide groups, a lot of these groups, which you can see here by the black dots, they form intramolecular hydrogen bonds. And then I thought about, okay, this structure actually lives in water, so it's not very realistic that this conformation here is actually a conformation that is actually occupied in solution, because in solution we expect that there are no intramolecular hydrogen bonds, but that these amide groups form hydrogen bonds to solvent molecules. And you see that not only in these amide groups, but also in this polar loop here, we expect that there are a lot of water molecules that play a role. So this is then a potentially solution structure. And then if you compare the conformations, you see that they are vastly different. So this kind of sparked my interest in how can we actually deal with, how can we model conformations in solution? How can we come up with conformers in solution? And to have some more recent inspiration from the chemistries that we looked at. So we looked at the supramolecular catalyst. So this is a copper phenanthroline catalyst that can perform CN coupling reactions. And it has this calixarine moiety attached to it. And what you see is this is a macrocyclic ligand. It is very flexible. And when we try to optimize this in our typical implicit solvation models, what we see is that the entire cavity collapses. But we know from experiment that the cavity has to stay open for the catalyst to be active. So our standard models here did not really work out. So whenever we use an implicit solvent model, cavity collapsed and we cannot study the chemistries anymore. And then another example is this olefin metathesis catalyst. And we were absolutely amazed when the CREST tool came out and we played around with it. So this tried to see what we can get. And I mean, this is a known problem for these semi-empirical methods, but if you have a molybdenum, then although we are super grateful that we have these methods, the performance is not so good because we have a typical transition metal and the semi-empirical DFT methods are not really designed to work well for such systems. So another two examples that I hope by now I have convinced you that we were interested, or that is really necessary also to generate conformers and solutions. So of course the question is, how do we do this? Because what we want is we want explicit solvent molecules to have a reasonable structure. And then such a condensed phase system, of course, it's not really, it's not reasonable, or it's not doable and not feasible to describe this at the full QM level. So what we thought, what we could do is we could describe the entire system at a molecular mechanics level to kind of explore the potential energy surface of this condensed phase system with molecular mechanics, so with molecular dynamic simulations. Now, if you want to do that, of course, I mean, you see we have these transition metals here, and they are typically a challenge for any kind of force field, because first of all, before we can even start our calculations, we need to come up with reasonable parameters. And what was really important to us is that we keep a reasonable structure and a reasonable geometry at the metal center. So the next challenge was then, how do we generate these molecular mechanics parameters? And this was a really, when my PhD student looked into it, this was kind of a really tedious process. So first of all, I just show you the smaller structure here. We need to start from a reasonable geometry. So we need to start from something that is either an experimental structure or a DFT structure. So that like a full DFT optimized structure. Then what we need to come up with is we need to split it into all the fragments, look at how the fragments are connected, and then we can actually get parameters for each of the ligands separately. And, you know, if you only look at these fragments, these are only organic, so no transition metals. So this is all fine. So we can use the standard method to generate parameters. Then, of course, we also need parameters for the metal and the ligand. And yeah, this is the first thing that goes into the force field setup. Then the second thing is that we also need parameters for the metal and the ligand. And we used a method that was established in the 1990s by Seminario, and I'm pretty sure that there are also others. So where we rely on the quantum mechanical Hessian and use that information, the Cartesian Hessian, to come up with a force constant. And then we can get parameters for the metal and the ligands based on this reasonable DFT or structure. This is then another part of the force field. And of course, we also need non-bonded parameters, and especially we need partial charges, and we also use the standard RESP fitting to get the partial charges. By doing that, we kind of have now all the ingredients. So we have the parameters of all the ligands, we have the parameters of the metal and the ligands, and we have all the non-bonded parameters. And this is essentially everything that we need in order to set up our force field. Now, when you think about it, that we want to generate conformers and explicit solvent, this is, of course, only the first step. So then what we have to do is, when we have the force field, we need to set up the simulation. So we need to put the solvent into the solute into a solvent box, need to equilibrate it, and so on and so forth. Need to run the simulations. So this is our molecule in explicit solvent. And then what we get out is a trajectory. But what we are interested in are conformers. So we are interested in which conformations are populated the most during this trajectory. So what you need to do is you need to cluster the trajectory, the different clustering algorithms, and then you get these representative structures. These structures can then, of course, we cannot take them as they are, because these are then structures that were generated by molecular mechanics. And it might be necessary that we re-optimize them either with QM or with MM. And by looking at this entire protocol and also looking at the previous slide, you realize that this is a really long and tedious process. So in order to make our, and hopefully also your life, a little bit easier, we have implemented all of this in our PyConsolve package. So basically what you need to do is you need to provide a molecule that you are interested in studying and a solvent, and then you just feed it into the program, and then everything is done automatically. So the entire force field generation, the setup of the simulation, the clustering, the re-optimization, everything is done automatically. Of course, we have not programmed everything from scratch, but we interface to Orca, multi-WFN, and then to rely on the Ember simulation engine and some other smaller tools. But this all integrates together, and it's very straightforward and very simple to use it. And if you want to try it out, you also find it on our GitHub. And by having this kind of workflow now established, we can go ahead and we can apply it, for example, to study reaction mechanism. And as I said, it's all, if you want to try it out, it's on our GitHub page. And you can also, if you have any issues, if something doesn't work the way you like it, you can also yes, set up or put these issues, then we will look at it and find a solution for it. Okay, just one quick example where we applied this. So we used this kind of technique to study the CN coupling. And we used it to study the CN coupling, not with your typical palladium or platinum catalyst, but with a kind of a copper catalyst. And this is the active center of the copper catalyst. This is, of course, a structure that you've seen before. So you have the copper phenanthroline unit, which is, so to speak, the active center. But the entire catalyst is then the one with this macrocyclic ligand. And by having this kind of protocol now, we can generate meaningful conformations of this catalyst and explicit solvent, and we can kind of compare how the reactivity of the active center differs from the full catalyst. And this is what you see here. So in black, we have the energies of some intermediates and some transition states of the small model system. And then in blue, we have the energies of the intermediates and transition states of the full catalyst. And what you see, it's not necessarily need to go into all the details. It's more or less the same. I mean, of course, there are some differences, but one major difference that really surprised us is when you go from 7 to 8, and this is basically the release of the product. So we could really show that this macrocyclic ligand facilitates the product release, and it has to do with the fact that if you only look at the model system, then there's still a hydrogen bond between the active catalyst and the product. And if we go to the supramolecular moiety, so if we go to this cavity, then this hydrogen bond cannot be formed. So what we have by kind of having this entire protocol is that we can now not only generate conformers in solution, but we can also study really large and flexible catalysts. Okay, so and this was nice. So now we have tools available to study the conformers, but there's actually maybe a little bit more to it. So if you think about complex solvents effects, this is basically the interaction of the solvent molecules with your solute. And of course, ideally, you want to describe this all at to be most accurate, you want to describe this all at a quantum mechanical level. However, I showed you just before that this is not doable. And in order to generate the conformers, for example, we completely relied on molecular mechanics. So if we go to a very approximate molecular mechanics and molecular dynamics level, we can describe this explicit solute-solvent interaction, but this may not be adequate enough if we are really interested in the electronic structure properties of our molecule. So what quantum chemists typically do is they don't really care about these explicit solvent molecules, but they use a much simpler formalism, and this is these kind of implicit solvation models. So rather than describing explicit solute-solvent interactions, they just resort to kind of a continuum model where we typically only model the bulk properties of our solute, of our solvent. Of course, this is a simple method. It is quite, in many cases, it works well until it doesn't. And it doesn't work well if we have solvent molecules that are strongly interacting with our solute and that massively impact our electronic properties of our molecule under study. So given these two extremes, that on the one hand, we have the implicit models, on the other hand, we have the explicit models that we cannot really afford, there might be a third way, and this is by only taking the most important molecules, so the most strongly interacting molecules, treat those or include those in a quantum chemical model and discard or approximately describe the rest by a continuum solvation model. And these are the so-called microsolvation models, and they have been known for many years in quantum chemistry as well. But when you think about such microsolvation models, there are actually a couple of questions that come up immediately. First thing is, where do you put these solvent molecules? How many do you actually use? And how are they oriented? And again, this is something that ideally you don't want to do, you don't want to decide just by chemical intuition, and you don't want to do this by hand, but you want to have it based on physical quantities and in an automated fashion. And this is what we came up with, a protocol that kind of does this automatically and decides on how many, or kind of gives a quantity or a physical quantity based on which you can decide how many molecules you want to include. Okay, how do we do this? So again, we run an MD simulation of our solute in explicit solvent. Now, you've seen that if we take any structure, we just let it run, we get different conformations. And in order for this Microsolvation algorithm to work, we have to identify first the relevant conformations, and then we need to run a restrained MD simulation for each of these conformers. If we have that, we can kind of look at the solvent density. So we kind of look at the entire trajectory and see where we have higher density of solvent, where we have lower density of solvent. This is the second, one of the informations that we need. And the second information is that we take our simulation box and we kind of slice it up into small boxes. And then we can resort to grid inhomogeneous solvation theory. This is a theory that has been developed by Mike Gilson's group at UCSD a couple of years ago. And what we can do is we can quantify the interaction between each of these grid voxels and the solute. So we can assign thermodynamic values to these grid voxels. Okay, this is all the information that we need. Then how does it work? So first of all, we look at the solvent density. Then we place solvent molecules, in this case water molecules, at the points of highest density, subtract the water density from that point until like 95 to 99% of the density is assigned. And then we get water placement. So first of all, we only get oxygen placement. Then we look at the OH vector and we get the water orientation. And then we look at these voxel interaction with a solute. And we kind of look in which voxel an oxygen, a specific oxygen atom is located. And then we assign the delta G value of this grid voxel to this oxygen. So what we then have is we have water molecules. So we have solvent molecules with delta G values. So we now have a quantitative measure how strongly these water molecules are interacting. And of course, we can rank them according to the interaction strength. Okay, let me give you an example of this urea toy case. So this is our Phoebus. So this is called free energy-based identification of solvation sites. And I have a couple of examples. So this was our toy example. We have the urea here. We see there's one strongly interacting molecule. You just take it. We can optimize it. We can look at the first 6 ones. We can optimize it. And we can also look at the first 13 ones. And you see it gets pretty messy pretty quickly. However, if you compare it to, for example, 3D rhythm, which is a method that kind of treats solvent molecules as kind of rigid spheres, we see it kind of nicely matches up. So we have 3D rhythm density or solvent density where we also have placed our molecules or our solvent molecules, and we also compare to ab initio MD and experimental data, and all nicely matched up. So of course we can also looked at more examples. One is this benzo-tribonyl. This is kind of a water catcher where we find in the crystal structure exactly one water molecule. And you see already by looking at this interaction diagram, there's also one water molecule that is really strongly interacting. And this is not fake. So this was really the position that our Phoebus algorithm detected. So again, a good agreement between experiment and calculation. Of course, we are not restricted to structures, so we can also look at this kind of 2 tautomers. So these are 2 amino benzothiazole tautomers that can occur in these 2 forms. And it has been stated in the literature that the hydrogen transfer is water assisted. And then there were studies how many water molecules kind of are ideally suited to minimize the reaction barrier. Of course, we cannot study the reaction barrier because this is only classical MD simulations. But what we can do is we can run our protocol, look at the most strongly interacting water molecules. You see that we have, in each case, we have kind of 2 water molecules that seem to be involved here in this hydrogen transfer, and a third one that is also coordinated here. And then if we just take the 2 that are involved in this transfer here, we can nicely see how this would assist the transfer, the shuffle of the proton. And what is important here is that our algorithm predicted that it's 2 water molecules that are ideally suited. And if we compare this to this quantum mechanics study where they looked at 1, 2, and 3 water molecules, they found the lowest barrier for 2 water molecules. So again, a nice match between full quantum chemical studies and our sort of approximated MD studies. And then basically not a couple, but 1 year later, there was an entirely different algorithm. So our algorithm starts from the bulk and then kind of reduces it to the most important conformers. And in 2022, there was a different method that kind of builds it up from the single structure and then adding 1 by 1 water molecules, and they actually found for the same system a similar result. Okay, I'm gonna try to keep in time. So last example, this is a methyl cobalamin. So you have this methyl group here. Otherwise, it's kind of the same vitamin B12 derivative. Of course, we can generate now the conformers with our tool. We see that if we generate it in water, we don't have any intermolecular H bonds, which is great. And then, of course, we can study the solute-solvent interaction. We can pick, for example, the first 5 water molecules. We see that they are mostly located around this loop here and some amide groups down here. And then if we include more water molecules, we see that, you know, they are eventually coordinating to all of the amide groups. Okay, so this was my last example of the methyl cobalamin. Our microsolvation method has up to now a major drawback. Up to now, it only works for water as a solvent. But I have a master student who is about to finish his master thesis soon. And what he does is he's extending that methodology to arbitrary solvents. It had some kind of tricky things to really make it applicable to any kind of solvent, but he's working at, so that should be out also in the foreseeable future. With that, I would like to wrap up. So I hope I could show you that we have this fully automated conformer generation tool that allows us to generate conformers in arbitrary solvents. We have this top-down microsolvation approach where, again, we start from the bulk properties and then kind of look at the most most strongly interacting solvent molecules. It is applicable to kind of a variety of systems. And as I said, this microsolvation approach is limited to water, but at least we have at least two different water molecules, but this will be extended to arbitrary solvents soon. And I hope that I could give you a little bit of an impression what we did or what kind of tools we developed to model solution chemistry. Of course, I didn't do this work on my own, but I would like to acknowledge my small but really strongly working and fiercely working team. In particular, you see my PhD student here who was involved in or who did came up with the PyConsolve tool and did all the Python implementation. And then next to it is Lucas, who's working on the quantum chemical microsolvation. Also, funding is acknowledged, and I'd like to thank you for your kind attention, and I hope that there's still left at least for 1 or 2 questions.